Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. We have back with us today Dr. Al Kertz of Andhil LLC. Today, we'll be talking about long hay feeding and abnormal calf behavior. Dr. Kertz, nice to see you.
Good to be back, always.
For those of you that are joining us here today, we thank you for taking time to tune in. And if you have any questions, feel free to post those there in the chat area to the right of your screen. If you're joining us through social media, Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn, simply post your questions directly in those channels and we'll get those to Dr. Kurtz. So, Dr. Kurtz, fill us in. What do we need to know about long hay feeding?
Well, we have to give a little background here. In the late 1990s, research, especially on calf behavior and welfare, was especially developed by a group at the University of British Columbia. And then not only did they do a lot of studies, but their graduate students, when they finished, went to other institutions. And so that spawned even more work. So that's all good because it's another dimension we haven't in the past paid much attention to it. However, there is a relationship between calf behavior, especially feeding behavior, and what they're fed in terms of nutrition and physiology. So that doesn't always get considered. And that's a good reason that we need to be talking to each other across the board. So as an example of that, how this can affect feeding behavior and performance, if we look at the first table, this is a study that was done in the early 1970s, but not published until 2007, when I kept encountering it on dairy farms. And it simply shows the difference between a starter, if it's all pelleted, or if in a texturized farm, where 45 or 50% of it is, say, cracked or whole corn, maybe some oats, maybe some barley. So this was at that time in use was a early weaning program at about a month of age. So the numbers don't necessarily relate directly to what we see today, but they do compare to each other. So for instance, if you look at the daily gain over the 8-week period, remember they're weaned at the end of 1 month and are not fed much and eat much up to that point. You see there's 7/10 of a pound daily gain with the all pelleted versus 9/10. And these are all significant differences. So starter intake was much higher with the texturized. The first week they were observed ruminating was 3.7 versus 6. Percent of time ruminating was over 20%. And this is similar to what we would see in mature cows. And the rumen pH was higher. In general, calves have low rumen pH because I think mainly they don't have a protozoa population, so it's not in the upper 5s or 6 like it is with cows. And then when you looked at the digestibility, you see all the digestibilities were increased when it was texturized versus pelleted. Now, why does this happen? It's very simple. When calves ruminate, they do that because they want to reduce the particle size of the diet that they consume, just like cows do. So if it's all pelleted, there's fine particles, so there's nothing to cause them to ruminate. But when you have a coarse or texturized starter, you have these particles which the calf brings up into its mouth, chews. When it chews, it produces saliva. When it swallows the smaller particles with the saliva buffers the rumen and keeps it from becoming as acidotic. So that's a beneficial effect. Now, sometimes you can see this in stark conditions, and I've seen that in a number of times. Part of this was because at one time in the 1980s, a major feed manufacturer made a move to develop an all pelleted calf starter when texturized were pretty normal at that time. And what we saw was the calves would chew a lot to try to compensate for lack of particle size, especially on wood that was available, fence posts, barn lumber, you name it. And so I've seen it even more recently. In the next slide is a picture of calves who are doing that. These calves were 2 months old. They had just been weaned. They had fully available in front of them in the manger or feed bunk a pellet starter. But even before I got there, I knew exactly what was happening because I could hear them. They're chewing the edge of that wooden bin, that feed bin, because they're acidotic. And when they chew, that produces saliva. They swallow it, buffers their rumen, and reduces their acidosis. So you can often see that happen and use this because there's a lack of textures or particle size in their ration. Now, another confounding factor is gut fill. So if we look at the next slide, nope, back up one, I'm sorry. The table right at the bottom of this slide, we see a study that was done in British Columbia where they were looking at behavior things, and they were feeding as a control what was called a texturized starter. But the texturized starter only had 14% flatted barley, 13% flatted oats, 10% steamed corn. That total was 37%. I think it needs to be a minimum of 45%. And each of those were processed. Corn and barley, or corn and oats does not need to be processed or only cracked, whereas barley should normally not be flaked because it's very fermentable starch, and that makes it even more fermentable, which makes it more likely to produce acidosis. So what they did was they also had a treatment where they provided some hay with it. And the title of the study says that hay was beneficial to the calves. Well, the only reason it was beneficial, if you look at that table, you see that the rumen pH on what was called a texturized starter was only 5.06. When they had hay available, remember they had some acidosis, so they ate some hay enough to bring it up to almost 5.5. But when they were eating that hay, the rumen wasn't functioning that well. It was accumulating in the gut, and so they had gut fill. And they only knew this because they sacrificed these animals and measured it. But even the authors of the study didn't recognize what was in their data. So when we see the weight of the rumen full, we see that it was 21.7 pounds when only provided with the starter. It was the body weight with the rumen was 217 pounds and 206 with the starter and hay. And so there was almost 18 pounds of rumen with the digesta for the starter alone, or 28 pounds the starter and hay. So the difference is almost 11 pounds of gut fill. So if you take that 11 pounds and you subtract it from their body weight, that's the true body weight. So these calves, when they had gut fill, had less body weight, almost 11 pounds less body weight. But it's not something you could normally observe. So that's why it's important, if forage is involved in calves before they're weaned, that there be some gut fill measurements. And usually the only way of doing that is you have to sacrifice some of those. So with that as a background, then let's look at a study that was done recently in which they were looking at calf behavior when providing hay either in a bucket or in a big PVC pipe about 4 inches in diameter with holes cut in the side. It's a very novel idea and a good way of looking at behavior. So these calves they all had 3 buckets in front of them, and in the control, they only had the starter available, whereas in the treatments, they had hay in a bucket or hay through a pipe. So they all had the same number of buckets in front of them. Different treatments had different variations in front of them. When the calves had, of course, when they had no hay, and they were fed a control, I was concerned as to what was the nature of that. So I emailed the major professor, and she provided me with that information. And so if you look in front of you now, you see on the left the bucket that had the, the starter. Now, most people would call that texturized, and it is partially texturized, but poorly texturized, because you can see not much corn in there, not even sure there's any oats. You see a pellet, but in addition, the pellet doesn't look like it's a good quality, so there's a lot of fines. So if you want to limit calves' starter intake, create a lot of fines with a little bit of texture, and they don't eat it very well, and they won't have good rumination and saliva buffering, and so they're going to have marginal acidosis. So it's not a positive control. It's really like a negative control. So then if we look at the data in that table, the next one, there you go, you see that their daily gains before they're weaned, 1.1 pounds, 1.34 when hay was in the bucket. When they had to pull hay through this cut opening in the pipes, it was 1.32. So they had similar daily gains. When you look at all 60 days, you see that the control, which again was marginal acidosis, not quite 1.2 pounds daily gain. When they had hay available, it was 1.5 pounds in the bucket, 1.39 when they had to pull it through the pipe. So they were benefiting by additional gain. But what we don't have is a measure of gut fill, and in all likelihood, calves had had hay were getting gut fill. So that could influence their what we see as body weight. Now, if you look at the starter intake, again, you see that the average per day was 0.48 for the control. It increased when they had a little bit, ate a little bit of hay, because that buffers the rumen and gives them better appetite. So it went up to 0.68, and similar to that, when they pulled the hay through the pipe, 0.66 pounds per day. So you see a classic situation where hay was beneficial to these calves simply because they had a starter that was not in good shape and produced marginal rumen acidosis. And in all likelihood, the hay and it caused some gut fill, but there was no direct measure of that. So when the calves were either fed the hay in a bucket or pipe, they ate about the same amount, had similar daily gains because they were able to pull it through the bucket. Um, when they fed hay, they spent more time drinking water than the control or pipe fed hay fed calves. And again, water intake is directly related to dry matter intake. So the calves would eat more starter and ate some hay on each of those treatments. So that caused them to drink more water. Usually it's about a ratio of 4 pounds of water per pound of dry matter intake. And then the control calves were observed spending more time manipulating the empty pipe in front of them because they all had the empty pipe. Otherwise, that's an uncontrolled variable. So the upshot was it did show that it didn't make the calves much difference in their oral behavior, whether the hay was in a bucket or in available through the pipe. But in both cases, they were better off than the calves fed to control because the control fed calves did not have a good quality starter.
Very good. A reminder to post any questions that you might have for Dr. Kertz. Also, if you haven't seen it already, we've posted Dr. Kurtz's column there in the chat. So you can take a look at that if you want to look closer at those tables or go over that information. So interesting information, Al. And as we always like to ask at each of these segments, what then would you say is your bottom line in all of this?
Well, it's whenever calves pre-weaned calves are fed on any kind of study, whether the focus is animal behavior, daily gain, or whatever it is, you have to consider the nature of the starter that's fed and whether it's fed with or without hay, because that can confound and predetermine what kind of results you're going to get. The only way to avoid that is if you fed a well texturized starter and it doesn't need any hay, so you don't feed any hay. So then that would take that starter out of the equation. But then you have to remember that the results only apply to those cases where a well-fed, well texturized starter was fed. I just recently finished reviewing for another journal some articles, and in both cases, I had to point this out to the authors of the study that they were feeding a meal starter and then they feed some hay with it. Well, they have to understand that that determines the kind of results they get. And then when they compare it to other studies, they have to look at the other studies and evaluate what they fed those calves as to whether that's a comparable situation or not. If you don't do that as research people, we're confusing ourselves and our readers because we're not fully interpreting the results properly.
Can't compare apples to oranges, right? And in research,
Exactly.
you got to compare to the same. And yeah, and the
Well,
other part is, go ahead.
well, and that's what I told in one of those cases. I said, you can't compare apples to oranges to bananas to mangoes.
There you go.
So you have to consider how, any study that you're evaluating relative to your study, how are those calves fed? What was the farm of the starter? Because that determines whether it's a valid comparison or not.
And then don't forget about how important that starting ration is, how you get those calves started, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
Very good. Well, we want to thank you for your insight today, Dr. Kertz. As always, we appreciate you taking time and joining us here on 365. Likewise, we appreciate all of you joining us. We know you have busy schedules, so giving us a little bit of your day is very much appreciated. A reminder that all Feedstuffs 365 sessions are available in on-demand format. Also, we want to let you know if you haven't seen it yet, you can now find Feedstuffs 365 on feedstuffs.com, so directly on our website. So if you see some sessions you want to tune into, you can just go to feedstuffs.com, scroll down to the Feedstuffs 365 session and click and go in from there. To all of you dairy folks out there, we'll be seeing you soon in Madison at World Dairy Expo, and we'll be catching up with Al there as well. So until next time, for Feedstuffs 365, I'm Sarah Muirhead.